Hi, everyone. My name is Leah Zamborski. I'm a licensed professional counselor with Ascension EAP, and today I want to talk to you about mental illness in the workplace. This is an issue that comes up frequently, and often leaders and sometimes even HR don't really know how to address it, what to say, what not to say. So today I hope I'm going to help answer some of those questions. Our objectives today, we're going to talk about signs of mental stress, injury, or illness, just kind of a quick overview of things you can be watching for. Discuss ways to initiate conversations about work performance and mental illness without overstepping. So there are some things you absolutely should address and talk about, and some things that you just need to be careful about what you say and how you say it so that it's not perceived, in terms of discrimination and things like that. So I'm going to help answer some of those questions today and how to have those conversations. So to start, let's talk about what is mental illness. According to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, you don't have to remember that. It's just a book that mental health professionals use to diagnose disorders, and it gives all the criteria and how you can rule things out and etc. According to that book, the DSM, it says mental disorder unfortunately implies a distinction between mental disorders and physical disorders. There's much physical and mental disorders and much mental and physical disorders. According to the National Alliance on Mental Health, a mental illness is a medical condition that disrupts a person's thinking, feeling, mood, ability to relate to others, and daily functioning. So for example, you know that if your pancreas isn't working correctly to provide and create the right amount of insulin, a person will develop diabetes. And we wouldn't say that's a mental illness, but it may lead to some mental symptoms. Have you ever seen a person with low blood sugar who's getting kind of loopy and feeling lightheaded, right? So that has a mental component to it, but we don't consider that a mental illness. Mental illness, we do consider, it's just a problem with the way you think and the way that you feel, but there's always that underlying physiological component. The reason why they're not thinking optimistically or their mood is really down and depressed is because neurotransmitters and different chemicals in the body aren't being regulated and produced correctly. And so it is a physical disorder, but it creates these mental symptoms. So when we differentiate mental illness versus physical illness, we're really doing people a disservice because by and large, they are one and the same. So when you are concerned about an employee, and you can extrapolate this to family members, friends, whatever, but we're talking specifically about the workplace today. You want to watch for changes in normal functioning. So it might be changes in appearance or hygiene. We're going to talk about Bob. Maybe Bob used to be very clean shaven, he smelled good, he looked good, and lately he's been coming in kind of disheveled, unshaven, stinky. Those are kinds of things that you want to watch for in terms of appearance or hygiene. Mood swings, irritability, or prolonged negative mood states. If they just don't seem like themselves, you walk up to Bob and you're afraid to say anything because is he going to snap at me today? And that's different than how he was previously. If a person has difficulty concentrating or remembering, now we all have difficulty with this, and some people more so than others. That doesn't necessarily mean they have a mental illness, but if you notice they're more forgetful than usual, or they're missing things that they normally would have gotten. If you're noticing signs of burnout, compassion fatigue, increased mistakes or errors, or just lack of disinterest in work, broken relationships, or more conflict or drama, the person discloses personal stress, distress, or trauma, and especially the person makes comments about wanting to end their life. And then it may lead to a safety risk and concern, which I would like to address in a subsequent video, so watch for that. So how do you provide support at work? I'm going to talk about this case scenario, and I want you to think critically about how you would handle this person. So let's talk about Bob. Bob is usually an upbeat, hardworking employee. He's been with the company a long time and has an excellent attendance record. But lately, Bob has been coming into work late, about 2 or 3 times a week. Also, he doesn't look so good. Sometimes his hair is disheveled and he has bags under his eyes. Everyone knows Bob is going through a nasty divorce. His work performance has been a bit shaky, but he's such a great guy and everyone feels bad for him, so no one says anything. But more recently, it's gotten even worse. Bob has come into work smelling like alcohol on a few occasions. In the past, Bob has been so easygoing and laid back, but now people walk on eggshells around him because he's so irritable. So as a leader or even a co-employee with Bob, what could you determine? Could you say A, Bob is probably an alcoholic? Would you say B, Bob is probably depressed? Would you say C, Bob is just going through a hard time. Or would you say D, Bob probably needs substance abuse or mental health counseling? What do you think? Probably an alcoholic, probably depressed, just going through a hard time, or needs substance abuse or mental health counseling? Okay, so here's the answer. None of the above. Because unless you have formal training in mental health or substance abuse assessment, it is not appropriate for a leader, a coworker, a family member to make any of those determinations. People get trained in learning how to recognize signs and symptoms, what level of impairment they're at, and what resource would be the best fit. So unless you have formalized training in that, it's really not your place to make those determinations. And this is where an EAP can be incredibly helpful, because EAP, employee assistance programs, are designed to partner with workplaces to help make those determinations so that you're not put in a place of liability where you're telling your employees they need counseling when they really don't. So EAP staff are trained professionals who can determine if a person has an addiction, a mental illness, situational stressor, or something else. The EAP counselor can make recommendations regarding appropriate treatment or action steps, and then case manage that treatment, keeping the employer updated, but only as needed and with written permission. So if the employee does end up with a diagnosis or something like that, the EAP counselor would go to the supervisor, the HR department, with that written consent. I want to make that very clear. It's up to the employee whether or not this information is released. And then say, yep, Bob's going to need some time off of work and I'm going to case manage that for him. And here's what you can expect on your end, right? But they're not going to disclose that personal information that would put the company at risk of, discrimination, things like that. So what about Bob? Bob's supervisor pulled him aside and had the sometimes speech. So you might be wondering, what is the sometimes speech? The sometimes speech acknowledges there's a problem and it offers an open door and a lot of compassion. So, for example, the sometimes speech might sound something like, Bob, you've been a great employee here for a long time. Lately, though, I've become increasingly concerned about you. I've noticed that some days it looks like you haven't showered or shaved, and you've been making a lot more errors in your work lately. Sometimes issues like these are a result of personal issues or concerns. That may or may not be true for you. It is your choice to tell me about those things or not. It's your business, but I want you to know that I do care. So you can see in that little spiel that the supervisor acknowledged the problem. You're not coming into work with the same attitude, the same grooming, there's problems in your work performance and they're pointing that out, but then they're being compassionate. Sometimes this happens as a result of work or personal problems and that may or may not be true. You can tell me if you want, you don't have to, right? So it's compassionate, but it also holds the person accountable. Okay, so the sometimes speech also provides resources and sets expectations. So the next part of the sometimes speech might sound like, if it is true that you're dealing with some personal stuff, we have the EAP. Do you know about it? It's a free and confidential counseling service. I'll never know if you use the service. That's between you and them. But whether or not you choose to use the resources I've offered, the bottom line is that your work needs to improve. I need you to be showered when you come to work, never use alcohol or other substances before work, and check your work for errors before you submit it, right? So you're providing resources, opportunities for help, but you're also setting the expectation that things need to improve. So here are some tips to make that a politically correct conversation. The employee may never disclose a problem to you, and that is their right. So don't ask questions about their mental health, diagnosis, etc., but do listen if they want to share. So when employers get that information, it kind of muddies the waters a little bit in terms of liability, because then if you're making decisions about their work, holding them accountable, and you know that they have a mental health diagnosis, are you discriminating? In most cases, the answer is no. You're holding people accountable, and that's perfectly acceptable. But you never want to pry for that information. That's the bottom line here. If it comes up, that's fine, but don't ask for it necessarily. Focus on behaviors that are causing a disruption in the workplace or interfering with productivity, like Bob's grooming when he comes to work, his work errors, his lateness. Those are all things that may or may not be symptoms of mental illness, but that's what's appropriate for the workplace to measure. And when having conversations about productivity and work performance, it's okay to ask questions with a help me understand attitude, but again, don't pry. So, what's going on? You going through a hard time? How can I help you here at work? So you want to be open, you want to be compassionate, but you don't want to be nosy necessarily. So what about Bob? After the sometimes speech, Bob's performance did not improve. So Bob's supervisor decided to implement corrective action with HR involvement. That's a very important piece to that. And stipulated that Bob make an appointment with an EAP counselor by the end of the week. Bob must also follow counselor recommendations. And we like to have it set up that way because when an employer says you have to go meet with an EAP counselor 3 times, sometimes that gives the employee just the option to come sit and we say, hey, what's going on at work? Nothing. I don't want to talk about it. Right? So that's kind of a wasted time for the counselor and the employee. And if they have to do that 3 times, okay, we've checked the box that it's done, but nothing's really been accomplished. When you say meet with an EAP counselor by a specified time and follow counselor recommendations, then it's up to the counselor to say, you know what, I think he's going to need 3 sessions, or EAP is not really the appropriate place for him. He needs long-term counseling. We need to get him into a rehabilitation facility or something like that. Again, the counselor can make those recommendations, and you don't have to be in a place where you have to figure out what the person needs. Let the EAP counselor decide that. Now, we know that Bob's going through a nasty divorce. We know that something's going on that's taking a toll on his mind, on his affect, lots of things. And now he's got problems at work and he's put on corrective action. Do you think that's a harsh course of action? And some kind of soft-hearted people would say, yes, he's going through enough already and now you're putting more on him. My perspective is that it seems harsh, but it's tough love, because if you don't hold him accountable at work, things might progressively get worse and worse and worse over time until Bob hits this rock bottom place where the situation is dire or hopeless. And as the workplace, if you can intervene and say, hey, we notice something's not right and we need you to fix it, we're offering you opportunities, we're offering you resources, we're offering you support, let's get a handle on this. That's actually a very compassionate conversation and course of action, rather than just let Bob spiral out of control. And again, the workplace can't necessarily provide counseling or those things that Bob might need. They might suggest those resources or push him towards those. But what the workplace can control is the workplace expectations. And often that is just, I wish I could show you from my side what that can mean to an employee. Often they're very angry and upset. How could my supervisor do this to me? They betrayed me. But in the end, once they're pushed to meet with the EAP counselor, they realize, hey, this wasn't so bad. Hey, I'm starting to improve. Hey, things are going better for me. Hey, people care about me. There's a lot of great things that come out of this. So I would challenge you not to see it as, just putting something else on them when they're going through a hard time, and rather seeing it as an intervention of love and compassion. So Bob met with an EAP counselor who assessed Bob's concerns, and together they decided on a course of action. Bob signed a release of information stating that the counselor could share with his supervisor that he had come to the appointment and that work goals were in place, but all personal information was kept private for the liability's sake and for Bob's, integrity and dignity and things like that. There's a lot of personal stuff that they'll share with the counselor that the workplace does not need to know, and that's a great position that EAP is in, to be able to share what you need to know and withhold what you don't. So when the counselor called the supervisor for an update to see how things were going at work, the supervisor asked if Bob was an alcoholic or depressed. And the counselor explained that both of those issues are irrelevant to the workplace. The bottom line is that the supervisor could expect Bob's work performance to improve. And if it doesn't, the supervisor should call EAP right away. So the nice thing about these mandatory referrals is when that release is signed, there can be that two-way communication so that Bob can be getting support from both sides, from the workplace and from the counselor. And if things are deteriorating at work, but Bob's saying, yeah, things are going fine, it's nice to have that supervisor perspective. So it's nice when we can work hand in hand with the supervisor. After a few weeks, Bob was improving at work, but still struggling. So with the counselor's help, Bob applied for FMLA and took a few weeks off of work. He continued to see his counselor during this time. So Bob just needed a break. He was overwhelmed. He couldn't handle it all. He needed to get a grip, as I tell my kids. So FMLA in this case was the right course of action, and the counselor helped him with that. Now the counselor, in some instances, may be able to sign an employee off for a limited amount of time, but usually they need a referral, or they need to see their primary care doctor, or they need somebody who's going to make an official diagnosis to really implement that FMLA. And again, the EAP counselor can help facilitate all of those connections. So it's a great resource. So talking a little bit about accommodations, FMLA isn't technically an accommodation under the law, but sometimes it kind of is. So accommodations are legally stipulated by the Americans with Disabilities Act. And that act was created so that employees with disabilities can enjoy the benefits and privileges of employment. And that might be a physical disability that the person needs a wheelchair, or might be a mental disability that the person has a mental illness. Um, but accommodations need to be reasonable in terms of the employer. Reasonable is they don't impose undue hardships on the employer. We can't ask you to renovate the entire front of your building so that you have a handicapped ramp. I mean, maybe that would be reasonable for your company, but if you're a small company, probably not so reasonable, right? So reasonable is it doesn't impose undue hardship on the employer. And this law typically applies to employers with 15 or more employees. So there are some nuances and exceptions, but I would suggest that you talk to your legal counsel if you want to know the ins and outs of it, but typically 15 or more employees. Many people with disabilities don't need accommodation, and a short accommodation may be all that's needed. For example, a flexible schedule for return after an illness, right? So Bob's been off of work for a while and he's not ready to just jump back in at 40 hours a week. Maybe he starts out at half days. Or I had a situation one time where a lady had attention deficit disorder. She was highly distractible, and her desk was right by the hallway where people were walking by all the time. She said, I just need my desk to be in a more quiet place, facing a wall. That was a reasonable accommodation, right? Helped her to do her job better. So an accommodation might help them work more productively with fewer health and disability costs. It's good for the company and it's good for the employee. So what about Bob? Finally, after Bob's return to work, his appearance was drastically improved and his work performance was back to normal. He still calls his EAP counselor every once in a while for support when he needs it. So I hope you have a little bit more understanding of how to hold people accountable, what kind of symptoms to watch for with mental illness, how to have those difficult conversations, how to be compassionate but also fair. There's a lot more I could say about this, but I'm just going to leave it at this and welcome you to call Ascension EAP or shoot us an email if you have any more questions. The phone number is 800-540-3758 and the EAP email box is eap@ascension.org. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this. I hope you have a great day.